My name is Margot Elwyn, and the last words my father ever said to me in public were, "You can leave." It was at his retirement dinner, a grand affair at a Manhattan rooftop restaurant, packed with bankers, executives, and people I'd grown up calling Uncle, even though they never remembered my name. My father, Franklin Elwyn, had just lifted his glass to give the final toast of the night. For a moment, the room softened. He spoke of legacy, family, pride. And then, he raised his crystal flute a little higher and said, "Only 2 of my children made me proud." The applause started before the sting could fully set in. Then he looked at me, right at me. "You can leave," just like that. The clinking glasses fell quiet. Chairs shifted, eyes turned. I stood up. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear the scraping of my chair. Shame poured over me in hot waves. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn this man's approval, and now, he'd erased me with a sentence. But then, another chair moved. My husband, Graham, stood beside me, tall, calm, and cold as stone, and what he did next would unravel everything my father had built, brick by brick. If you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong in your own family, stay with me. You need to hear what happened when Graham spoke. Because that night didn't end the way my father expected. Not even close. I grew up in a house where success wasn't encouraged. It was enforced. Our colonial in Westchester looked picture-perfect from the outside. Inside, it was a pressure chamber dressed in crown molding and mahogany. My father, Franklin Elwyn, was the kind of man who didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. One glance, one barely perceptible frown, could send a shiver down your spine. He ran Cumberland Trust like a king overseeing his court, and he ran our home the same way. My mother, Abigail, was his queen in title only. She folded herself into the corners of his ambition, elegant and quiet, always 2 steps behind him. She never contradicted him, at least not in front of us. When she died of ovarian cancer the year I turned 20, the last bit of emotional insulation between me and my father went with her. I was the youngest of 3. My brother Lucas was the heir apparent. He'd been groomed for investment banking since middle school, varsity debate, Wharton undergrad, straight into hedge fund management. Victoria, my sister, graduated Yale pre-med and went on to become a neurologist. She's the type of woman who makes brunch feel like a board review exam. And then there was me. From the beginning, I was the anomaly. I spent my allowance on secondhand poetry books. I painted murals on the inside of my closet. I cried when characters died in novels. My father never understood me, and worse, he never tried. When I was accepted to Emerson with a scholarship to study literature, he said, "You're wasting your time with stories. No one pays for dreams." Then he cut off financial support entirely. I made it through college on student loans, 3 part-time jobs, and too much coffee. Somewhere in the cracks between exhaustion and lectures, I discovered a different kind of ambition, the kind that didn't need his permission. By 30, I'd founded a small indie publishing house called Northlight Books, focused on debut fiction from marginalized voices. We started tiny, just 2 titles our first year. By the 3rd, one of our authors made the regional shortlist for the Fenwick Prize. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't corporate, but it was mine. Still, no matter how much I built, some part of me remained suspended in that old house in Westchester, waiting for the moment he'd finally say, "I'm proud of you, Margot." That moment never came. Lucas once told me, with a smirk, that he couldn't remember a single time our father had read a novel. I remember wondering why I still hoped someone so fundamentally uninterested in my world might one day step into it. I met Graham at a used bookstore downtown. We both reached for the same weathered copy of The Master and Margarita. He let me take it, then offered to buy me coffee instead. He was the first man who didn't find my ambition quaint or confusing. He asked about my mission, not just my revenue. He called my company a lighthouse in a stormy sea, and that name, Northlight, stuck. I married him 2 years later in a garden behind a Brooklyn brownstone, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and not a single blood relative. My father had RSVP'd with a blank envelope. Victoria texted, "I'm on call." Lucas didn't bother replying. I told myself I was fine with it. I wasn't. Not really. But that night with Graham felt like the start of something new. It would take a retirement dinner, a crystal toast, and a room full of silence to burn the rest of that old hope to the ground. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock with raised navy ink, formal and impersonal like everything my father touched. Franklin Elwyn, Chief Executive of Cumberland Trust, cordially invites you to an evening in honor of his retirement. I stared at it for a long time before showing Graham. "He's reaching out," I said too quickly. "This might be a gesture." Graham raised an eyebrow. "Is it? Or is it a power move wrapped in calligraphy?" I wanted to believe the former. I needed to. Maybe retirement would soften him, make room where there had never been any. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally willing to see me. "Let's skip it," Graham offered gently. "We can spend the evening on the coast, just us. You don't owe him anything." But I felt the old tug, the irrational pull of a daughter still aching to be acknowledged. "I have to go," I whispered. "One more time." The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. My chest buzzed with that familiar anxiety, a restless, unspoken dread that had followed me since childhood, the feeling of walking into a room already marked as the disappointment. I spent the afternoon of the event getting ready like I was preparing for battle. I wore a steel gray sheath dress, structured, minimalist, confident. My makeup was precise, matte, with no hint of shine to betray nerves. Before we left, I stood in the mirror, adjusting the neckline for the fourth time. Graham walked up behind me, placed his hands lightly on my shoulders. "You don't have to do this," he said. "He doesn't get to define you anymore." "I know," I replied. But the truth was, part of me still wanted him to. A panic attack hit in the car, sharp, sudden. I couldn't breathe. Graham pulled over without a word, held my hand as I counted backward from 60. "You've already built a life worth being proud of," he told me, voice steady. "If he can't see it, that's not your failure." I nodded, though my heart was still racing. The restaurant, the Celestine, stood gleaming against the Manhattan skyline. Marble floors, gold fixtures, and a sweeping view of the city my father loved more than his children. A hostess led us to a private elevator that opened into the rooftop banquet room. It was a theater of wealth. Crystal chandeliers, sleek white linens, uniformed servers circulating with truffle arancini and flutes of veuve. Lucas was already holding court by the bar, surrounded by investment execs. He greeted me with a smooth grin that didn't touch his eyes. "Margot," he said, as if the name surprised him. "Didn't expect you." Then, to his group, "My little sister runs a publishing something, right?" Before I could respond, he turned back to a man discussing a billion-dollar exit deal. Victoria was near the appetizers, in a crimson dress tailored to perfection. She glanced at me, then my shoes, and offered a faint smile. "Gray," she said, nodding at my dress. "So sensible. I suppose you have to be when you're not in medicine." Her fiancé appeared, a plastic surgeon with a cleft chin and the self-awareness of a scalpel. I excused myself quickly. Every corner of that room screamed, "You don't belong here," and yet I stayed. Because that's what you do when the people who raised you convinced you that love comes with conditions. You keep showing up, hoping maybe this time they'll let you stay. We were seated far from the center, while Lucas and Victoria flanked my father's table, along with board members, former executives, and a handful of family names with net worths you could Google. Graham and I were placed at table 11, near the fire exit. Our companions were distant relatives I hadn't seen since adolescence, and two junior analysts from Cumberland Trust who clearly didn't want to be there. The menu was printed on heavy cardstock, 3 courses, wine pairings curated by some Michelin-recommended sommelier, but the food tasted like paper to me. A woman across from us, someone who introduced herself as my father's third cousin, asked what I did. "I run an independent publishing house," I said. "Oh, how sweet," she replied. "A little hobby business. Keeps you busy, I'm sure." I smiled politely and reached for my wine. Graham touched my knee under the table, grounding me. "Excuse me," he said to her, tone light but firm. "Northlight Books is in its 4th year. They just landed a citywide literacy grant." She blinked and turned to her salmon tartare. From across the room, I could see my father. He was holding court effortlessly, leaning in as guests laughed and clinked glasses. He looked more alive than I'd seen him in years. He hadn't even glanced in my direction. A few minutes later, someone touched my shoulder. It was my father's older sister, Aunt Margaret. Tall, elegant, and as emotionally evasive as my father. She air-kissed near my cheek, leaving the faint scent of rose and restraint. "Margot," she said, "you look... well." Then she lowered her voice. "Try not to take up space tonight, dear. This is important to him. You know how he gets." I stared at her, stunned, but she had already drifted away. The lights dimmed subtly. Servers cleared plates with quiet precision. A line of empty flutes appeared on silver trays. Dessert was brought out. A delicate trio of mousse, fruit tart, and a chocolate medallion with Cumberland Trust's logo embossed in gold foil. I didn't touch mine. Then came the microphone. A thin man in a navy suit tapped it gently, calling the room to order. Speeches began. The bank's CEO extolled my father's leadership. A former peer shared golf anecdotes. Then Lucas took the mic. He spoke fluently about legacy, vision, and how Franklin Elwyn had modeled excellence for his children. Children, plural. But the weight of his words only fell in one direction. He spoke about working alongside our father, about learning what it means to make decisions that move markets. Victoria followed with a shorter speech, framed like a medical case study. She praised our father's discipline, his uncompromising standards. She made a joke about how, even as kids, he graded our report cards like quarterly earnings. Laughter rippled through the room. Then it was my father's turn. He stood slowly, commanding the room without effort. 66 years old, and still the gravity around which everyone orbited. He didn't need notes. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, voice rich with confidence. "Tonight is not just about my career. It's about what remains when the desk is cleared." He talked about mentors, mergers, and the decades he spent shaping Cumberland into a pillar of stability. Then his tone shifted. "But a man's legacy," he said, raising his glass, "isn't just balance sheets or boardroom wins. It's who carries forward your name, your values." He turned toward the head table. "Lucas, my brilliant son. Victoria, my unwavering compass. They are the Elwyn legacy." Applause exploded, glasses lifted, and then he looked at me, eyes cool, expression unreadable. "You can leave," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room went silent anyway. For a second, no one moved. Then the whispers started. I felt all 70 faces turn, felt the heat crawl up my neck. Years of conditioning told me to obey, to vanish. But this time, something else happened. Before I could push my chair back, another chair scraped beside me. Graham stood, and the room held its breath. Graham didn't flinch, while I sat frozen, humiliated, trying not to let my father see me fall apart. My husband stood slowly, deliberately, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The scrape of his chair cut through the silence. People turned. My father's face darkened. "This doesn't concern you," he said sharp. "Sit down." Graham didn't. Instead, he reached for his water glass and gently tapped the rim with a silver spoon. Ping. The room responded like a trained animal. Attention pivoted toward him. "I'd like to make a toast," Graham said evenly. "To the daughter Franklin Elwyn just asked to leave." My breath caught. My father stiffened. "You're out of line." "I'm not here to flatter you," Graham replied, eyes locked on him. "But since this night is about legacy, let's talk about what you've built." He looked around the room. Margot Elwyn built a publishing house from nothing. No trust fund, no name to trade on. Just vision, grit, and a belief that stories matter, even the ones people like you dismiss. There were murmurs, shifting chairs. Someone set down their fork slowly. "She worked 3 jobs through college when you refused to pay for her education. She kept going even when you told her she was a failure. And tonight, you tried to erase her in front of all of you." He paused, letting the weight settle. "In front of people who should know better." My father opened his mouth, then shut it again. Graham's voice was steady. "You want to talk about legacy? Here's one. Margot took time off college to care for her dying mother, while her siblings chased credentials. She read poetry at her mother's bedside when no one else showed up. That broke something open in me. Graham raised his glass. So thank you, Franklin. Thank you for making it absolutely clear who you are. And thank you for reminding Margot, and all of us, what real strength looks like. It's not power, it's dignity. It's surviving your silence. He turned to me, voice quieter. You don't need to earn a place in a room like this. You already belong wherever you stand. He took my hand, and together we walked out. No one tried to stop us. But as we reached the exit, an older man I vaguely recognized, one of my father's longtime colleagues, gave me a quiet nod, a flicker of something like apology, or maybe respect. Behind us, the room exploded in whispers, but I didn't look back. We didn't speak until we were blocks away. The city lights blurred outside the car window, but I couldn't stop staring at my lap, stunned by the silence that followed the storm. I'm sorry, I whispered. Graham reached over and took my hand. Don't be. I've wanted to say all of that for years. I laughed once, bitter, breathless. He'll never forgive us. Then we're finally free, he said. That night, I sobbed until my voice gave out, not just for the humiliation, but for everything I had swallowed for 34 years. The small betrayals, the quiet dismissals, the longing that was never met. I expected to feel emptier. But what settled in its place was something unexpected. Relief. The next morning, my phone lit up with missed calls from my father. Then came the message. If you don't issue a public apology, you'll be removed from my estate. I stared at the screen, and for the first time, I felt nothing. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight washing over the dishes we hadn't cleaned. Graham poured me coffee and passed over his laptop. I did some research, he said. There's a therapist who specializes in family trauma. Her name's Dr. Eleanor Ward. I think it's time. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because I was tired of bleeding for someone who never noticed. A week later, I sat across from Dr. Ward, clutching a tissue like a lifeline. Tell me about your father, she said. And I did. For the first time, with no edits, no disclaimers. That began the slow, uneven work of reclaiming myself. 3 months later, we made the decision to leave New York. Graham had been offered a position at a Seattle-based firm that developed accessibility tech for schools. I found myself drawn to the idea of distance, not to run, but to rebuild. Northlight Books would continue, just from a different coast. I think we're not escaping, I told him one night. We're choosing peace. He smiled. That's exactly what we're doing. 1 year later, I stood in our Seattle kitchen, holding our newborn daughter close, her breathing soft against my neck. Outside, Graham grilled in the drizzle, chatting with neighbors who had become more like family than anyone I shared blood with. Our house was smaller, quieter than the one I grew up in. No grand staircase, no silent expectations hanging in the air. Instead, there was warmth, books stacked on every surface, and laughter that came easily. Northlight Books was thriving. We'd launched a new imprint focused on memoirs about healing and family estrangement. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming voice. I read every manuscript like it was part of my own recovery. On our mantel sat a photo from our wedding. Graham and I mid-laugh, frosting smudged on his nose. The frame had cracked the night my father slammed our door for the last time. I kept it that way, because only the frame broke. We didn't. Jason called sometimes. We talked, cautiously but kindly. Once, he said, "You knew who you were before any of us did." It stayed with me. Victoria never reached out. And my father faded. No apology, no closure, just silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, one that no longer demanded anything from me. One evening, rocking our daughter to sleep, I whispered words I had never heard from him, but had always needed to. You don't have to earn my love. It's already yours. She stirred gently, and in that moment, something shifted. Because I realized I wasn't just speaking to her. I was speaking to the younger version of me, the girl who tried so hard for approval that never came. She didn't need it anymore. She was home,